Scott Hansen here from NFL Red Zone. I hope you're checking out 1 hour of 5 Yard Rush, one of the best podcasts on NFL football in the UK.
Good morning, Rush Nation. Here we are. We are getting even more ready. I hope you enjoyed the show last night with me and Stocks. I hope you enjoyed the waiver wire pickups. Today we're going to do some starts and sits. I only gave people sort of a little bit of notice on this, so I don't have that many to go through. So instead, what I'm going to do is just go through a few things that I've put together. Some players I would say are must start, some players that I would say we're considering sitting. I've also written my column for Fantasy Pros for wide receiver matchups against cornerbacks. This hasn't published yet, but I'm going to go through some of the selections in there to keep an eye on. So I'm going to go by position first of all and look at players who I'd say are players that you want to be starting this week. To start with, when we're looking, there's the must starts, right? So I'm not going to sit here and just name every player you must start because that's pretty obvious. But instead, I'm going to go through and sort of just highlight the ones that are sort of what I call roster, but not roster bubble, but start bubble. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you to start Josh Allen. You drafted him as first quarterback off the board in most leagues, so that would be sort of naive to say. So instead, I'm going to give you players that have sort of advantageous matchups and players if you're sort of on the edge for, then players you should consider starting. So let's start with the quarterbacks in the must start. So the must start this week, I would say is there's two. One is Baker Mayfield, who I talked about in the waiver wire show yesterday, so it shouldn't come as much of a surprise against Washington. That's a defense that they can easily start to exploit and put points on the board for. So I think that's going to significantly help when it comes to thinking about a streaming quarterback, or if you've got Justin Herbert, you're not sure he's going to go. Baker Mayfield's a pretty good option this week. The other one is Matt Stafford. Matt Stafford has Detroit that had the sixth most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. And they allowed, a very, very healthy amount of points last season. I think I was reading something about the fact they've given up 25 points on 8 or more occasions last season, as well as these two teams did also meet in the playoffs. And Matt Stafford was highly productive in that. He put up over 20 fantasy points in that game. So Stafford's a pretty good option to start in week one. I think Detroit will be better on defense this year, but I think Stafford has the weapons to exploit that. If you're looking at sort of fringe running backs to start this week, Javonte Williams is a really good one. I think for me, with the fact they've cut P. Ryan, I think McLaughlin's going to get some touches, but I think Williams is going to be the guy. I think you're going to have to look at the way that Sean Payton runs his scheme. Last season, the Broncos threw their running backs over 32% of the time. That's quite a big statistic that jumps out there for me. So Williams appears to be reasonably healthy, at least better than he has done at any point in his career starting a season, it seems. So other than his rookie season, perhaps. So I quite like the idea of Javonte Williams this week against Seattle. That seems to be a good matchup. As well as also Gus Edwards against the Chargers. I think this is going to be a good game for the Chargers. I think that you would expect them to win this week, especially if they do have Justin Herbert. And I expect them to lead with Gus Edwards. This looks like a move that will really be fruitful. It's obviously hard to sort of sit here and say how this is going to sort of scheme up from touches, but I imagine we're looking at Gus Edwards being the goal line back, Gus Edwards being the one that's going to be more likely to poke the holes through and be productive. So I like him as a start this week for sure. I love Chris Godwin as a start, and I think it's going to be a really, really, really good opportunity for Chris Godwin to start well. So the Commanders allowed the third most points per game to slot receivers last year. Chris Godwin's going to have a highly accelerated role in that slot. Now that he's got Liam Cohen, you've heard me talk about this all off season, so this shouldn't be a surprise that he is a pick for me. But you should be seeing him go in there because it was the lowest. He had the lowest slot rate of his career last year under Canellas because Canellas really schemed a really basic, simple offense, and Liam Cohen's not going to do that. He's going to expand upon the talent that this roster has. So I think you're going to see Godwin go back more to the slot, those intermediate passes, and I think he's going to be the main weapon on Sunday, although Mike Evans also has a very favorable matchup in this one. So I expect the Buccaneers to go up early and utilize Chris Godwin to control the game and push down the field. So I imagine it could be a pretty decent day for him. And then I'm going to pick a player in the in the game between the one in Brazil, so between the Packers and the Eagles. And I'm actually going to go with Jaden Reed. Again, we're talking about a team that's really bad against the slot. The Eagles were by far the worst last season for players giving up points in the slot. They gave up over 2 points per game more than the next worst team. So really shocking. So I like Jaden Reed on Friday/Saturday morning. If you're looking for some interest in that game. And that's a big thing to remember is this isn't your conventional week one because you've got Thursday night football, then you've got Friday night football. So you have to be a little bit aware when you're doing your lineups. Make sure you don't put your Friday players in your flags. Some other players when I'm looking at wide receivers, and this is going from my column that was picked for Fantasy Pros, they should be going out, I imagine, tomorrow, being Thursday, depending on when you're watching this. So players that stand out for me, Rashid Shaheed, he's got Troy Hill. I think this is a massive mismatch. I think Shaheed could have a really good week one. I think Calvin Ridley against Tyreek Stevenson will have a really, really good week one. And if you're looking for a really deep sleeper in your dynasty leagues or in a really deep league, then Jalen Naylor, I've talked about, has a really advantageous matchup in week one. He's up against Drew Phillips, the rookie. And I think that's a really good opportunity for Naylor, especially as Sam Darnold probably will be a little bit more conservative week one rather than go throw a load of balls that deep down the field. So I really like those three players. Other ones that I think have got really advantageous matchups, and these are all must starts anyway. AJ Brown, Mike Evans, Jalen Waddle, Chris Olave, and Justin Jefferson are the five that I've highlighted that could have massive week one. So keep an eye on all those five players who have high advantageous matchups. Going to the tight end position, and there's two that I would recommend starting this week. One is Colby Parkinson. So Colby Parkinson has Detroit, and again, you've got this scenario where the Lions do allow a lot of points to tight ends. They were bottom 8 in terms of points allowed to tight ends, so in top 8 worst, however you want to view that metric. So that's again a good matchup to exploit. And then Noah Fant is another one. I think with the volume, I think he's going to see a really good amount of volume. I've got him touching the top 13, top 14 this week. So both those players, I think, are players that can take advantage and you can really get some good production there. We move to the sits. The easy sit for me this week is Brock Purdy against the Jets. That is just a really nasty matchup. It's going to be really difficult for Brock Purdy to navigate that, what is probably the worst secondary in football to play against. And then on top of that, you've got Brandon Ayuk, who hasn't trained and hasn't been with the team. He's only just come back since signing his contract, so hasn't had a lot of time and reps. He might be a bit slow to get going. Christian McCaffrey isn't quite 100%. He's missed all the preseason with a calf injury. It looks like he's just returned back to practice. So again, as much as I don't think these guys need loads of practice, there's a timing and rhythm that I think is really difficult. And this is the worst matchup scenario possible for Brock Purdy week one. So really, he's only got a relationship with Kittle and Debo that he's played with, during scrimmages this offseason. So I think it's going to take a bit of time for the 49ers to get in sync and get going. And therefore, I just think this is a matchup. If I'm a Brock Purdy owner, I would try and swerve and avoid this week. We now have this situation. I'm fading both running backs here for the Steelers. I mean, Najee Harris is one that kind of stands out as a player that you would look to take advantage of and go, okay, well, this might be a decent opportunity. But Jaylen Warren is back for week one. that's going to really convolute things significantly. And I just think it's a really, really tough matchup. I don't see either of them being inside the top 30 this week. And as a result, I think they're just players I'd rather stay clear of in week one. So I would just be a little careful of that one. When it comes to the Steelers in particular, I don't think either of them are going to finish inside the top 30 this week. And then you got Chuba Hubbard. Chuba Hubbard against the Saints is a tricky one. Saints are pretty good against the run. I also equate Austin Eckler in this class against the best run defense. Another sit for me would be, I talked about this on last night's show, would be Jaden Daniels. I forgot him at quarterback. I scrolled through my notes and I totally missed him. We saw what happened last year with Justin Fields. Justin Fields only had 3 yards rushing against the Bucs. The Buccaneers are a great containment team. Jalen Hurts didn't have that many in the playoff game either. I think this is a really tough ask for Jaden Daniels in his first week. So I'm sitting Purdy. I'm sitting Jaden Daniels this week at quarterback. And then, I'm sitting Eckler this week. I think this is a poor matchup for Eckler. I think it's a poor matchup for Hubbard and also for the Philadelphia wide receivers, Pittsburgh running backs as well. I absolutely lost my chain this week. If I look at the wide receivers here, it's a tough one. I think Brandon Ayuk is going to struggle this week again. Same reason for Purdy. I think this is a tough offense. And I think Deebo Samuel is going to be up against Sauce Gardner, which I think is really difficult. But at least I think he's going to have volume and he's probably going to get some rushing carries that will carry him nicely. But I do think that Brandon Ayuk is going to struggle a little bit in week one. I've still got him at sort of the back end of the wide receiver 2 conversation. But so I'm not saying like he's a complete sit, but I think just temper your expectation slightly there with Brandon Ayuk. Other players that have got challenging matchups. Deontay Johnson, I think, for me, is a hard sit against Marshawn Lattimore. You couldn't have asked for a worse matchup week one for Deontay Johnson on a new team. Marshawn Lattimore is one of the best shutdown corners in the league. I think that's a really difficult matchup. DeAndre Hopkins, I'm not sure how. I mean, he's going to play, but I'm not sure how 100% he really is. Up against Jalen Johnson. I mean, no cornerback was targeted less on routes run against him than Jalen Johnson last year at 9%. So I think that just means it's going to be really difficult for Deontay Johnson. And we know he's a good separator, but even so, it's going to require Bryce Young to be 100% accurate or very accurate. And Will Levis to be highly accurate to exploit Jalen Johnson. I don't think that's 100% the case. And I think that you're going to see Hopkins run a lot of routes as a decoy to get Ridley open, who has a much better matchup. And then Zay Flowers is a tricky one against Trent McDuffie. I'm not so sure that I love him as a start this week. I've got him as sort of a low-end wide receiver 3, maybe even a flex play. So he's a player I'd consider. It's hard to sit given where you drafted him and given you might not have better options, but he's a player I'd be sort of marking down ever so slightly. I would also say that other challenge matchups, I talked about Deebo Samuel, Tyler Lockett against Riley Moss is one I'd be sitting. Tyreek Hill is a tricky matchup against Ronald Darby, but I think he's kind of matchup proof, but it's challenging matchups worth noting. Michael Pittman against Derek Stingley Jr. is going to be a tough matchup, and DJ Moore against L'Jarius Sneed. That's also a really tricky one as well. Other players I'd be considering sitting this week, I think Raheem Mostert is going to be a tricky one to start this week. I've talked about Austin Eckler. I think Keenan Allen could be a really difficult one. And I think any of the tight ends for the Bears, Cole Kmet and Everett, I think are really, really difficult starts this week. And I think if you're looking at potential players who are going to, not necessarily players you should sit, but players you should just temper expectation for, I'd be looking at David Njoku, Dallas Goedert from the tight end position. I'd be looking at Puka Nacua because I'm not sure how entirely healthy he is. Zeke Elliott for me is a hard sit this week. DeAndre Swift, I think that's a tough matchup. So I'd just be really careful on some of these players as well. And don't be surprised if Derrick Henry isn't the most productive either. And then Dak Prescott's a tough one. You have to start him, but I think it's a tough start for him. I got asked the question last night, would I sit Dak Prescott for Jaden Daniels? And I think if Jaden Daniels had a better matchup, that's well worth a conversation. But given how how difficult it is to run against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I think that's not a matchup I'd fancy. So I think you can get too cute, and I think I'd be starting Dak, but I do think it's a more challenging matchup. So that's going to cover it for the start sits today. I'd like to think that we've got through a good number, and that should give you a good feeling as to where we are coming into the season. Just be very wary of these fringe players. Be wary about your flex. Make sure you're starting the right players in your flex. Don't have anyone from Thursday's game or Friday's game in your flex. Make sure they stay Sunday. Make sure you stay fluid. Keep an eye on these injuries. Luckily, so far, there's not too many to keep an eye on. No one too significant. Justin Herbert's the biggest name that we're kind of watching for week one. And if we're looking beyond him, then I would say probably players like Marshawn Lloyd, both backup running backs for Green Bay, are questionable going into the week. So they're kind of about as bad as it gets. There's not that many questionable players as we're coming into week one, luckily. So it's a good place to be. But having said that, still keep an eye out on those players. I'm just having a look now. CeeDee Lamb's listed as questionable, but I think he'll play. Romeo Dobbs is questionable, but I think we'll see what happens. I don't expect Hollywood Brown to play. He's listed, I think, now as doubtful. I'm not entirely sure, but either way, I don't think he will play either. So that'll do it for the injuries. That'll do it for the starting sits. Thank you so much for tuning in. Tomorrow we'll be back for a bit of a preview on all fantasy relevant players in all matchups. So I'm going to go through my ranks and pull them all up and have them all prepped for you. So it's a big, long laundry list. I'll try and separate them through a little bit with some visual if you're watching the video as well. But thank you so much for tuning in. Much love to you all, and enjoy your Wednesday. And don't forget, as always, keep rushing.